Slavery was a very bad thing. But slavery has been over for a very long time. You see, newly freed blacks were given the ability to work and earn what they needed. Just look around you at the successful black people all over the country. Because whatever problems there are for blacks now, they are primarily their own damn fault. I mean, people were getting along until Obama came into office. Now, in this statement, two stupid sides of the same coin called ignorance. Because history is one of those fields where even people who can't remember a tenth of what was taught in one grade of high school, people who've read all the books in prison or the incense store, people who saw a black person once, lovers of soul food and hip-hop, they are all experts on the historic black experience. From the repository of all black knowledge, hidden away in the mountains of western North Carolina in a secret location, down around Meat Camp, up the Ball Branch Road, past a rickety old bridge. Welcome to What Ray's Saying, the podcast. This podcast has been a long time in the making. It's been the triangulation of my entire life into a perspective of the black experience in America. Growing up in poverty, through a military career, academics and storytelling on the live stage, I've been black through every single period of it. On this first episode, what's the story with blacks after slavery anyway? Two narratives that speak not to the life of the exceptional black, but the common. Life from the bottom up. Coming up next, after this.
Hey folks, this is Kevin Allison. I host the podcast Risk, where people tell true stories they never thought they'd dare to share. Risk is a little bit like some of the storytelling shows you might have heard on NPR, but we're completely uncensored. So we feature stories that are too emotional, too sexual, or too scary, or too controversial, or outrageous, or whatever for broadcast radio. When Risk first brought our touring show to North Carolina, Ray Christian shared a story on that show. He's on the Risk episode called Live from Chapel Hill with an incredible story called Comfortable in the Water. I was blown away, not just by Ray's realness, but by his depth. His heart and soul are in that storytelling. Then on Live from Chapel Hill 2, Ray shared a story called Child's Play. It was unbelievable, so surprising and outrageous. And on a recent Risk episode called Perception, Ray tells another one called The Candyman. So powerful. I'll tell you one thing, Ray has a poet's spirit and he's lived one hell of a fascinating life. I've gotten to know Ray as a friend over the years, and he's just as solid a man one-on-one as he is on stage. It's thrilling to see that Ray is putting all his passion and poetry into creating his own podcast now, What Ray's Saying. So keep listening as this new podcast grows over time, and tell your friends about it too. I think we're all going to feel like Humphrey Bogart did when he uttered the final line in Casablanca, "This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship."
In the aftermath of the Civil War, newly freed blacks in the South found themselves in a dangerous and confusing new world of freedom. A world where many former masters now refused to allow slaves to leave. Others were turned out with nothing at all, because all they had ever had was now the property of their former masters. Some slaves, including children, had their throats cut or were shot out of spite and anger by former masters who'd rather see them die than to go free. Returning Confederate soldiers, traumatized, wounded, desperate, depressed, demoralized, and angry, struck out at what they saw as the source of all they had lost and endured. They beat, scalped, raped, and murdered thousands of newly freed slaves out of frustration, fear, anger, and a desire to teach blacks to stay in their place. This Freedmen's Bureau, set up by the government to integrate blacks into a world of citizenship and freedom, and to protect those freedoms, was now a weak and impotent institution that received little support from the Union Army now in occupation in the South. An occupation army that failed to respond to the numerous complaints of rape, whippings, and continued forced labor. Now one of the greatest challenges to former slaves, a challenge that they continuously experienced, was trying to find family and trying to find out who they were. Because many newly freed slaves could not identify relatives clearly by name. Some were confused about the nature of their relationships, as marriages during slavery were not required and were always at the discretion of the master. Women and men were often forced to form multiple families through forced relationships, with many women not knowing the father of their child or could not identify a white man as such. Some couples found that they were brothers and sisters, some nephew and aunt, some no relation at all. Many black men who had previously were not allowed to play a role in the rearing of a child, men who had no right and no authority over their children, no power to protect, often humiliated, struggled to find their role of father. And with few examples, many took on the role of the overseer, demanding obedience and respect from their families, women and children, and often gave out severe punishment to enforce that role as they had learned it. Now, by 1877, the end of forced Reconstruction in the South and the end of military occupation saw the complete return of white supremacy. New laws were put into place. Laws whose purpose it was to reduce blacks to a state as nearly as close to slavery as possible were all implemented and put into place. These laws were all collectively known as Jim Crow. Where blacks were to treat whites with deference in all phases of public life. Where black men were required to tip their hats to white women, walk off the curb and give way to whites, never question or argue with whites. Blacks were not allowed to serve on juries or testify against a white person. Blacks who attempted to report crimes often found that they themselves were charged with crimes. Black men found staring at a white woman, touching, even if by accident, could be charged with rape. Seeing a white woman unclothed, or dare say a consensual sexual relationship, if discovered, a black man would be charged with rape and sentenced to death. possible that he'd be given up to an angry crowd for lynching, an activity that became a social event where distinguished community leaders, families, and children also would gather for the killing of a black man to take pictures and to bring home souvenirs. Now, one of the most hideous policies was known as the convict lease system, where a black man found loitering without work for minor offenses and for no offenses at all could be arrested and imprisoned for what would turn out to be a life sentence. See, black men were leased out to do dangerous hard labor in mines, back on plantations, civil engineering projects where they were given little food, no medical treatment, and severely abused until they died. Black women continued to suffer as black men were given no respect or grace. There were still 3 crimes a black man did not have to worry about being charged with: adultery, bigamy, abuse, and the rape of a black woman. An unbroken chain of events, not a series of stops and starts. All of this continues into the birth of my mother.
Hey friends, this is Christina Wong, performance artist and comedian, and you are listening to What Ray's Saying, the most hardcore, amazing shit you can imagine coming out of the middle of the forest, which is where Ray lives, because he has to speak truth, even from his farm. Peace.
I grew up in a rundown southern ghetto called Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia during the 1960s and 70s, where I attended elementary school decades after court-ordered segregation. But we still had not integrated the school system, so we had to make do with the used and torn books with a dozen blue signature pages that often had no covers, and all the old furniture from the white schools with hundreds of names carved in the desk with dates that went back 20 years or more. And at that time, complaining about white people by black children in school was never allowed, and we were often severely punished, spanked, whipped, paddled by our black teachers for disrespect in any form because, as it was often said back then, black children need to be severely punished to prepare them to survive in the white world. Now, despite my mother and her siblings being the first generation off the farm, we were still poor. But I was more fortunate than some of the kids in the families that lived around me, where children were forced to endure punishments that would have you arrested today. Kids who lived in families where they were beaten and whipped. And there's that term whipped again, a term that seems to have never went away, another legacy from the past. Kids were beaten and whipped for disobedience and disrespect of any kind. Henry, one of my friends from elementary school, would often find himself on the wrong end of an electric extension cord whenever he made the mistake of asking one too many questions when his daddy gave him instructions. Now, when we were in elementary school through middle school, I remember that he would come to school with these deep whelps, cuts, and scars that were slow to heal. All the familiar signs of being beaten with an electric cord. You see, his father, he often repeated that familiar refrain from school with a little add-on. You see, because it's better that I do it than to let the white man do it, he would say, because black kids need to be severely punished to teach them to survive in the white world. But Henry was not the only person in his home to be routinely beaten. Like his brothers and his sisters, his mother also shared in the abuse. Many were the nights that they ran out of the house over to our place after his mother had received a severe beating. I remember once seeing Henry's father punch his mother in the face so hard he knocked her teeth out and splattered blood across the room. This for questioning him about money. She would leave him, only to return the next day, because short of murder, she had no recourse. You see, Henry's father was never challenged by any authority whatsoever. He was never challenged by the school system, the community, or the law. Because even though his father had no real status and was a nobody in the larger world, the treatment of his black family was his business alone. His father often complained about how much shit he had to take from the white man to provide food for his family, and how desperate he felt, and he would unleash all that rage on his family. And by the time we were in high school, Henry had become so mean, and he'd become tough enough and strong enough to deal out the same damn punishment to other kids when he felt disrespected in even the slightest. He grew up remorseless, angry all the time, and he had little sympathy for others in pain. Henry took the world one day at a time and saw no future beyond the day we were living in. He learned somehow over time that crimes against other blacks were seldom ever investigated by the police. And he began to target people in our community for assaults and robberies. His crimes became rather brazen. He would snatch purses during the day, conduct home invasions and assaults. He became a plague on the community, and where law enforcement failed, a bullet in the back of his head by a person unreported completed a cycle of life and death, confusion, frustration, and ignorance for this descendant of a slave. Now, nearly 150 years after the end of slavery, a number of blacks in America are members of families that hardly advanced beyond the post-slavery period to this day. Yes, laws have changed, more opportunities are available, but there are generations of black Americans that find themselves fighting battles that were started hundreds of years ago. Yes, long before Obama came into office, black people have been struggling to live in a white world with each other. Long before Obama came into office, there have been those who wish to see blacks reduced to the level of inequality they were in the past, put in their place, or simply disregarded. Long before Obama came into office, black people have struggled to advance their lives, many deeply imprinted from a dark legacy and a humanity for the pain and suffering of other peoples with a common background and cultural experience. Long before Obama, the best indicator of future behavior has been past behavior. Now, life after slavery has not been a walk in the park or picnic or a free ride. It's been one continuous damn struggle that not all black Americans have been able to endure. Well, this first one has come to an end. It's been fun, and we got to do this one again. So, folks, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Write a 5-star review on iTunes. Send me your suggestions, your comments, feedback for topics of African American, Black American social issues that you'd like me to address. myths that you'd like to have debunked. So in future shows, I'll be talking about black complexion, light skin versus dark skin. Where's that come from? What's the issues behind that? Black hairstyles, speaking styles, the whole black-Indian connection, and historical interracial relationships. Special thanks to Kevin Allison and Christina Wong for all your support. I love you guys. The show is produced by me, Ray, with assistance from Dr. T, music and original beats by the amazing Beej Gordy Brooks. Until next time, bye.
You have been listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast, hosted by Ray Christian. You can find What's Ray Saying on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. If you've got comments, questions, or feedback, you can always reach us via Facebook or by emailing what'sraysaying@gmail.com. Ray says each episode is made with love, fatback, chicken feed, and fresh mountain spring water, but none of these are legal tender according to the electric company. To help this listener-supported podcast pay the bills and keep producing episodes like the one you just heard, you can click on our Donate tab on Facebook or go to paypal.me/what'sraysaying. Tell a friend or 2 or 12 or 20 what you just heard on What's Ray Saying, the podcast. Until next time.